Paul said back in Romans 6:14, "For we're not under law, but under grace." And we've also seen that in chapter 10 here of Romans, that Christ was the end of the law for our righteousness. And that wasn't righteousness to stand before God in salvation, that was our practical righteousness. And so, as I've said several times through these studies, the New Testament clearly tells us that we're not under law. And by New Testament, I mean the letters that Paul and John and Peter wrote to the churches, and they established we don't live by law. Now, when I say that, there are people that immediately think, well, you're throwing out most of the Bible, because the New Testament is just a little bit, and the Old Testament is a large bit. It's a lot of the Bible. And you're just telling us we don't live by that, so we're just throwing it out. And that's not true. That is not what we're saying. In our passage today that we're going to look at is going to affirm that there is a use of those scriptures that don't tell us precisely how to live. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. I have been looking here in the book of Romans at how God stabilizes us as believers. And in Romans chapter 15, we saw in verse 1, "Now we who are strong ought to bear the weaknesses of those without strength and not to please ourselves. Each of us is to please his neighbor for the good of his edification. For even Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches or the ridicule of those who reproached or ridiculed you, that is the Father, they fell on me." So we were looking at this yesterday out of Psalm 69, how Psalms gives us a statement that ends up being applied to what Christ endured, whereas as they heaped ridicule on the Father by the way they treated him at the temple and the way they treated his house, that ridicule then fell on Christ as he did the Father's will. And that comes out of Psalms. And there's actually quite a few places in the book of Romans where the Apostle Paul quotes from the Old Testament. Frequently, and this is one of those places where it says, "But as it is written," and the word kathos here is a comparative adverb. It's not saying it is the same thing. What it is saying is that this is an illustration of what Christ endured. It's to learn something because it's comparable, not identical. And we actually have this quite a bit in the New Testament. And that's important for what Paul's going to say next in verse 4. "For whatever was written in earlier times," or quite simply, whatever was previously written, it was written for our instruction. This word didaskalia is one of two primary words in the New Testament for teaching or instruction or doctrine. They're all different ways in English of expressing these two words. And the one word is the word didache. This word is didaskalia. They both come from the verb didasko, to teach. This word of these two has the emphasis of instruction that is intended for learning, but not particularly for practice or conduct, whereas didache was teaching that was expected to be followed. You learn this thing, now do it. And didaskalia doesn't have that same import. It has there's something else important about it, but not that issue of importance. And what Paul goes on to say is that these Old Testament scriptures, these things that were previously written, they were written for this instruction. They're written for us to learn something, not just some head knowledge, not just to have a set of facts in your mind, but for those things to sink in and affect the way you live, not necessarily be practiced. And so he gives us this statement here in the middle of verse 4. "So that through perseverance," or some of your Bibles might have patience, "and the encouragement of or from the scriptures, we might have hope." In other words, when you go through and you read these texts that don't tell us how to live, but they tell about what God was doing with other people, maybe what God was doing with David or with Daniel, you read about those things and you're saying, those people were able to go ahead and do what God gave them to do. They had patience in that. That's what perseverance or patience is. It means that they continued doing what they're supposed to do, even under adversity, even under hardship, even under pressure. And he says that through patience and an encouragement from the scriptures, it also involves encouragement because they see that God carries them through. God accomplishes what he said he was going to accomplish. Very important. And he says, we get that from the Old Testament. So you don't have to practice the Old Testament for it to be practical. It's practical in the sense that it encourages you that God took other people through the things he had for them. Those things may be different. And they related to his provisions for them, and those provisions may be different. But he took them through those things. He kept up his end of the deal. And you know what? Oftentimes, God even carried those people when they failed on their end. And that encourages us to have patience in the things we face. It encourages us, with encouragement, it encourages us in terms of what God will do, of God's faithfulness, of God's provision. Those are things we really need to value. You go back to your Old Testament, you read through the Old Testament, and there are big stories. Creation, God's a God of all power. And the flood, God's a God of power, but also righteous judgment. And God is a God of faithfulness to his covenant, and he brings Israel out. And we could go through these really big stories, but there's sometimes very small things that we read about what God did here or there. And those small things also can serve to encourage us to have patience. The Old Testament has value, and he has just quoted from Psalm 69 up here, and he says that Psalm 69, that he uses and compares that to what Jesus endured, uses that as an encouragement for us today in the way that we live, in the way that if you're strong, you bear with the weaknesses of those who lack strength, those who are weak in the faith, because you're confident God will finish in them the same work he's doing in you. You've seen the proof of it in the Old Testament. You're encouraged by his faithfulness again and again. It encourages you in the things God's given you to do. And that he will finish it, that he will do his part, that he will do his work. And that encourages us, as sometimes we're having to put up with the things that others are struggling with, to have a good day in the Lord. Thank you for joining me today.